Welcome back to the Peaceful Political Revolution in America podcast. The Anthropocene will be a doozy from what I'm hearing. Even if new technologies and new systems replace the ones currently falling apart, it will be a bumpy transition. Severe climate-related events will be occurring much more frequently. Annual wildfires are becoming monthly catastrophes. Flooding, coral bleaching, permafrost thaws, ubiquitous melting of our world's glaciers provide a bleak backdrop to the 21st century. Megatrends are not always obvious at first glance. Autocracies are on the rise. Democracies are in decline. Inequality is spreading. There is a genuine contest of political and economic systems being played out on the global stage. Democracy is being stress-tested like never before. But some might ask, is the freedom of speech and the freedom to vote, to be represented, really that important? Is governing ourselves really so much better than being at the mercy of a tyrant? Russia remains a shining example of what can go wrong in a constitutional democracy. After all, reforms were once a thing in Russia. Political lines were actually shifting for a brief moment in time. However, by 2020, the richest 1% of the Russian population received more than 1/5 of the national income. Corruption is not foreign to the former USSR. It runs rampant, and the concentration of wealth is the worst of all the largest economies in the world. Inequality remains a serious problem, regardless of the political system. For the vast majority of human beings, daily life is a struggle, while a small, if not tiny, fraction of society remains engorged and fat from the excesses of wealth and power, mobility and security. Alexander Etkind joined the Department of International Relations at Central European University in 2022. He previously taught at the European University Institute at Florence, the University of Cambridge, and the European University at St. Petersburg. His current interests are the political aspects of the Anthropocene, global decarbonization, and security in Eastern Europe, and he is here today to talk about his new book, Russia Against Modernity. Alexander, welcome to the Peaceful Political Revolution in America podcast. It's great to have you here.
Well, thank you very much. I'm happy to meet you.
I just finished your book. It was a fantastic read. You start the book with a chapter called Modernity in the Anthropocene. It's interesting to me how you framed that, because you're talking about paleo-modernity and Gaia-modernity, how this all relates to what's going on in Russia and with Putin. How do you see paleo-modernity in respect to Putin's vision for Russia? How is that comparing to what you call Gaia-modernity?
Right. So I was trying to conceptualize this idea that the current war, the Russo-Ukrainian war, and Putin's regime in general, this 2+ decades of the regime, is a sort of a response to or resistance, or actually a war against modernity. And it's intuitively plausible, I think, at this point. Of course, I started thinking about this much earlier when it was not so clear. But then, talking about modernity, it's such an elusive term and almost like an empty signifier, really. So I had to, I had to read a lot just to understand what different people meant by that and how it changed historically the very meaning of modernity along with modernity itself. And then I decided to distinguish between kind of the old modernity and the new one. And the modernity, well, that was actually a very easy choice to call it paleo. I actually spell it paleo-modernity but then so what is new or what is special about our modernity of our time? And that's, of course, is a crucial question. And the difference, of course, is about climate change, about limits of nature, basically limits of the universe, of human universe. Our ceiling that we have hit in our development growth, incremental growth of the economy, and technology and much else. And so this new modernity I call Gaia modernity. And I think the difference, I mean, what was paleo-modernity? That was, every year, every decade, people were more and more modern because they built higher skyscrapers or their engines were more powerful and more natural resources were used for all that, for shipping, trading, building, and fighting. So the more modern it was in paleomodernity, the more nature was exploited and just used, consumed, and burned in the process. So Gaia modernity works in the opposite way. The more we are modern, the less resources, natural resources we consume for the same unit of work and pleasure. And that's basically my definition, but there is much more to that. But it's like the Gaia modernity is about like small is beautiful. We need to be modest and prudent and consume less and create more and be more diverse and things like that. And this fight of Russia against modernity is really about sort of not just about returning to paleomodernity, because Russia has never left it. But at some point, Putin's Russia has stopped to match even those definitions of paleomodernity. It became truly anti-modern. It preached and practiced something that I called, that's my concept, stop modernism.
It's a very interesting framing and reminds me a lot of the last conversation I had with Peter Leiden. He talks about the current systems collapsing and new systems arriving, and replacing the old systems. So this is very much a very similar conversation that you are having also, right? This transition from paleomodernity to Gaia modernity. That's a different way of living.
Yeah, that's true. That's truly different way of living, working, having fun, and ruling. That's very important. But different way of governing.
Well, we talked about that, and I asked him, I was very keen on understanding how our political systems were going to be transformed over the next century, maybe even in the next decade. And it seems to me that there's a lot of room for improvement here. Certainly, you must feel the same about Russia. But Putin has this aim to keep Russia in this old style of ruling, this paleo-modern way of organizing society. You link that to the energy systems that we now have, the idea that Russia is a petro state. Seems to me to be the core of your book. Putin is caught in this dynamic where he's relying on the flow of oil to sustain his society and his regime. So that's a very important part of the picture, isn't it?
It is, and of course it is entirely anti-modern. Doesn't really fit Gaia modernity, because every decrease of burning fossil fuel or decrease in producing emissions deprives Putin's Russia, like any other petrostate, of a fraction of their profits, of the revenue. So there are some other petrostates, they have alternatives, but Russia does not. There is no alternative that has been developed, tested, and tried. And therefore, it's an existential interest of Putin's Russia to preserve the flow of fossil fuels.
Sorry, you talk about extraction versus labor
versus production. Extraction versus production. Really, I feel that we need to differentiate, these two basic political economic concepts. And of course, usually extraction of whatever coal or iron ore or oil is counted as, along with production of cars or whatever, computers or shoes. It's all goes together, in economic growth, whatever, GDP, etc. But I think this is the time. Modernity is the time to count them differently. And that's not a new idea, really. There was a guy, he was actually a Nobel Prize laureate, born in Ukraine, Simon Kuznets, a very important American economist. And he actually invented the ways to, working during the war, World War II, for the American government. He invented the methods of calculating GDP for different countries, like for Germany and for Great Britain, for America, like how to actually get numbers. And they discussed it, and their debates are very interesting because they did it, from scratch. And so his initial idea was exactly, to subtract the use of natural resources from the added value. That would be the actual measure of production.
We talk about externalizing costs. Is this
externalizing? These economists, they love this sort of collaterals or whatever. It's about subtracting.
You quote Ulrich Beck saying social inequalities and climate change are two sides of the same coin, right? So yet inequality is a massive problem in the world, and it's growing in the United States and Brazil, India. And it's arguably, like Peter said in the last episode, 1% of China owns 1/3 of the national wealth. I mean, democracies are supposed to be based on equality. This is Thomas Paine, who said all democracies should be based on equality, and that it also needs to be a global system. It's interesting to me that somehow Russia, after it dissolved, it never really became a fully democratic country, right? But I want to talk about the Constitution and the history of Russia a little bit too, because there's so much that has gone on there. But it's not a democracy.
So it's definitely not a democracy nowadays. Absolutely not.
No.
Relation between democracy and equality in Russia or the former Soviet Union is very tricky, and it changed several times. Nowadays, the contemporary Russia is the world leader in inequality. So it has sort of surpassed Brazil. It's way more unequal than China, and seriously more unequal than the United States or Great Britain. I trust Thomas Piketty, who basically came to this conclusion. There are debates about his methods and measurements, but I trust that. It feels very intuitive to me. But the Soviet Union was, on the other hand, the world champion of equality. So there was definitely no democracy in the Soviet Union. Never it was a democratic country during the 70 years, from 1917 to 1991. It was never a democratic country, but equality was very, very high, one of the highest in the world. And then, so that also challenges these concepts that maybe in American experience is very plausible, that equality and democracy are so closely connected. Because in the Soviet Union, it was not. There was equality, yes, no democracy, no. But then what happened after 1991? So in the Soviet Union, with all those countries, post-Soviet countries that were parts of the Soviet Union. So inequality exploded there, rose hugely increased almost everywhere, but in Russia, more, say, than in Ukraine. Or in Azerbaijan, another petrostate, quicker and higher inequality has grown than, say, in Armenia, a neighboring country that does not have oil. So inequality, this high and kind of fastly growing inequality is a particular feature of petrostates, not all of them, but it correlates with the proportion of fossil fuels in national economy.
That's interesting to me. You're saying Russia for a very long time was highly equal. What were the metrics? How is that measured? How is that defined, that equality?
There are historical works. I mean, you cannot trust the Soviets in their statistics and whatever. Because they preach that this is a country of equals. Equality was a Marxist and Leninist sort of ideal. But you cannot trust that, absolutely not. But still there are, in my book, actually, I give a review. You can find citations and whatever references. And this kind of studies were, developed like in the 1970s, mostly American historians or I guess sociologists. And indeed, that was equality on the bottom. So almost everyone were equally poor. There was, of course, lots of regional inequality, so that Moscow was, even in the Soviet times, was much richer per capita than whatever regions in Siberia, etc. But the difference was nothing in comparison to the contemporary differences.
You say that petrostates have unique problems. This is Russia, and it's not immune to these problems. And then you say neoliberal economists from Harvard described Russia as upper volta with rockets, you say.
Yeah.
But in fact, it was more like Qatar with a lot of people. So these professors from Harvard really weren't understanding what was going on, but it had some serious consequences for Russia.
Yeah, well, they understood, and I think they understood the problems of the past, and they understood the problems of the Soviet economy pretty well. But what to do in the present, how to deal, with political issues coming from this economic, crisis. I think nobody understood, and it is not their fault of these Harvard guys that they didn't. But then, nobody knew the future. And also there were, all kinds of allegations and actual allegations proven by the American court that some of these people had, insider interest. They invested in certain stocks and made lots and lots of money.
Yeah.
And became highly unequal, due to, to the insider nature of the Russian economy.
Mm-hmm.
That's also all references in my book. It's a public knowledge. Yeah, these American guys who operated in Moscow in the early 1990s. Yeah, they were not innocent. And some of them still some of them, most of them are still at Harvard or somewhere else, still occupying highly prestigious positions, which is not a problem. But some of them, like Jeffrey Sachs, like keeps insisting on keep producing really lies and myths about Ukraine, about Russia, about the war, somehow trying to justify those mistakes that had been done, 30 years ago.
Similar to what happened with the Chicago schoolboys in Chile.
Yeah, and that's the same school of thought.
Yeah.
Not the same school of thought, and I actually derive this neoliberal governance from the discovery of oil in the North Sea And it was which happened actually simultaneously with the discovery of oil in West Siberia. And then some Margaret Thatcher, could actually suppress the miners' strikes and produce this new neoliberal philosophy because she had oil and gas, instead of that coal, which needed that many.
You write in your book, sustaining extreme levels of inequality was more difficult for petrostates with large native populations such as Russia. How did this affect plans for the diversification of the economy and modernization and ultimately for democracy in Russia? This is a big turning point.
That's a big turning point, yeah, right, because you instinctively compare Russia with other petrostates, such as certain Arab countries, that have this, like whatever, Qatar or also Saudi Arabia. So they have similar outputs of oil and gas, and there's huge incomes that comes into the country.
Yeah.
But the population is much smaller than Russia's population. And then this population is kind of hierarchically organized. Here are the citizens of Saudi Arabia, and here are the kind of guest workers. And these guest workers have no legal rights whatsoever. It's like what I call internal colonization, but it's at least in Saudi Arabia, it's kind of supported by the law of the land. But in Russia, of course, according to the constitution, everyone is equal. Siberia is equal to Moscow, and natives are equal to Russians, etc. There is this additional problem that it is entirely unconstitutional. This growing inequality and appropriation of natural resources. But still, there is this big, very active and this, in certain ways productive population. Whatever, doctors work in hospitals, and professors teach in the universities, and barbers work in barbershops. So these people, they kind of they give services to each other. They are very low paid. They have no connection to the flow of petrodollars, because these petrodollars come to the state, which actually means Moscow, which also means the Kremlin, and then the Kremlin spends that. Now we see how the Kremlin spent it, mostly for the armaments and some kind of insane programs of militarization. Earlier we saw it less clearly, frankly, how much, because that was, in Russia, even the budget is classified. You don't really know. That is like an open part of the budget, and only the president runs that, non-transparent parts of it.
It's fascinating how Russia has ended up in this situation right now. That I have read up a little bit on the Constitution and the history of that, and just wanted to interject some of that into the conversation now, because as I understand it, like the Supreme Soviet of the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic adopted a new Republican Constitution in 1978 to replace the old Russian Constitution of 37, right? So that's kind of the big frame there. It was the fourth constitution of the Russian Soviet state, right? Following a turbulent period of democratization, the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and subsequent economic reforms, right? Constitution lost its legal force by a referendum in 1993, which was preceded by a power struggle between the president of Russia, Boris Yeltsin, and the Russia's legislative institutions, right? It's called the Congress of People's Deputies and the Supreme Soviet of Russia. Okay.
Yeah.
So that's a lot of stuff going on there between 1937 and 1993. It's a struggle.
Well, the struggle in 1993, actually, tanks shoot the Russian parliament, and that's the famous photos. That did happen, and the world mostly supported Yeltsin, believing that the parliament was like whatever, anti-democratic or reactionary or whatever, and probably it was reactionary, but how the parliament could be anti-democratic, So that was really an assault on democracy. And the outcomes we actually see probably only in 2014, the start of the Russo-Ukrainian war, we could actually understand the full price, the full cost of that assault.
Putin inherited power from Yeltsin. Yeltsin nominated him, was it prime minister?
He was prime minister for a while, but then he became president from the year 2000.
You write about parasitic governance, saying the leaders of the new Russia were instructed by top Harvard economics. They created a new rich whose yachts and villas grew bigger every year. When the Harvard boys left, it turned out the new Russian rich were just the same Soviet bureaucrats, lazy administrators on a flat learning curve. You know, it's the distribution of wealth, isn't it? I mean, this is a problem now in the United States. 50, as pointed out in the last episode, 50 Americans own half the wealth of the country. I mean, this should be alarming to people. How does it happen? What happened in Russia that, I mean, the people, maybe it's just the geography of Russia. It's so massively huge. How do you organize to confront the small oligarchy of people who are taking control of things? I mean, how does this happen? It seems like, we have the numbers. We should be able to overwhelm a small group of people who want to take everything for themselves. But again and again, in Russia and the United States, I would say, in China, people are just oblivious to this. They seem to not care. They don't respond to this. What is your take on that? Why do they continually get away with this?
Long and tragic story, also very funny story. I think it's like Russian story, of course. But the difference with the American example, is that still these 50 persons, they are private people, and they at least that's very little number. Say 50 people, they control that much. But still, they each have their own, usually his own interest, and they compete. They could even go to to karate match, as we see, between Zuckerberg and Musk. So they want to have it in Italy. So they really compete. They are different. 50 plus independent actors. The Soviet state before 91, it was just one actor. It was one big, very, very big thing that was ruled by these elders from Politburo, etc., of the Communist Party. They were elders, but of course, currently the current elders are older than those elders.
Oh, are they? Yeah. Wow.
Yeah, they are. Then this perestroika and privatization and neoliberalism, occurred in Russia, and all these assets that belong to the state were kind of distributed to the people. But how to distribute? Who will get what? Who will get something entirely useless, or who would get a barber shop? And who would get an oil field? And that was a very kind of tricky, very complex also schemes that were developed by Russian economists, Harvard economists, by very smart people. But then, so the explicit purpose was to create this. The new bourgeoisie, the new capitalists, the new oligarchs, so that they would run and compete and create added value out of all that.
I mean, were they trying to imitate what was going on in the United States or some other country? Was this a new approach? Was this something that they saw maybe in other countries? How did they decide that certain people would become, it was a bureaucracy, huh? They were creating a new bureaucracy?
new oligarchy, which turned out to be oligarchy, because very very soon it became clear that oil fields produce by order of magnitude more profit, more returns than whatever than a privatized clinic or something. So yeah, and you usually so you're an oilman, so you claim ownership here. You could invest some money. Where did you get? Maybe you got some loans. You still, to getting loans, you still have to go to the same state banks, because there was no independent money, nothing was there. So basically, oilmen got oil fields, and barbers got barber shops, and professors, they didn't get universities. Professors still, were state servants. And this inequality started growing hugely. It was like an explosion of that. And they're most kind of looking backward, it's very clear that it was only natural resources that gave returns, and everything else did not.
So the extraction industries were doing very well, but the labor market, the production of goods and services was really
stagnant, or in many ways decaying.
Yeah.
They created this oligarchs, which are exactly those people who are now nowadays are under sanctions, because they took part in the armament, in the military industry, or in direct financing of the war efforts.
Mm-hmm. You have these very few people at the top, the oligarchs, as you say. And you also have a number of different demographic problems, if not demographic disasters that were happening. You quote the American demographer Murray Feshbach saying in 2008, "The Russian nation is not just sick, but dying." And his colleague Nicholas Eberstadt called Russia's depopulation a terrible mystery. In his view, the health disaster underway in Russia is not only outside the Western experience in important ways, it may still be beyond Western understanding. So, and you did a wonderful job. I really want to recommend your book to people. I think it's a wonderful read. But you talk about the root causes of this depopulation and generational struggle within Russia. I mean, Peter, in the last episode, very optimistic, because we're, the millennials and the Gen Zs are, growing in number and coming into power, coming into their own. And that's a whole different shift. It's a wonderful idea, but the generational struggles in Russia are very, very different. The whole profile is very different there.
Yeah, it's a part of the problem of generations, also gender issues. They interact, as I showed, gender and generations, and this is like the power of grandmothers in the Russian family, much as the power of grandfathers in the Russian government. Both these institutions, the family and the state, they decelerate cultural change. They slow down any development, any change, any innovation or import of new things, like whatever, like internet or contraception or whatever, or new technologies. But that's a great utopia that first the US will be all states will be like California nowadays, blue and democratic, and built on IT and innovation and renewables. This will not happen for the world if Russia remains like this. It will not happen to the United States if, say, Trump remains in power. And it's highly symbolic and very, very meaningful that Trump and Putin had that idyllic relationship of mutual understanding and influence.
Yeah, you talk about Russian society, yeah, and you note the number of abortions, the use of alcohol, cigarettes is very ubiquitous, poor diets, lack of educational resources and the disintegration of the nuclear family, right? The absence of fathers, which is a very significant part of what's going on in Russia today. Suicides of despair are very high. And a very odd thing that you referred to called the grandfather rule, this patriarchy thing that is very, very strong in Russia. You paint a rather dismal picture of Russian society. And are there, I mean, you could go into that if you'd like a little bit to kind of clarify what I'm saying, but I'm wondering, are there any bright spots? What, if Russia is going to go through any transformation in the coming decades or years, is there any possibility that democracy is going to find a way to, root itself in that society? The society sounds very broken. Is there a bright spot there?
The bright spot is diversity. And this diversity of the Russian society is enormous. It's diversity, it's multidimensional diversity. Economic, cultural, religious, demographic, ethnic, and much else. It's a huge country, the biggest in the world, very thinly populated, so that there is not much of communication between different regions. And these different regions are hugely diverse. There are Muslim regions in the Caucasus. There are northern or more like Nordic peoples on the White Sea, in the Arctic, Russian Arctic, or on the border with Finland and Norway. There is Moscow, a hugely rich and sort of truly parasitic megapolis, which on the one hand, it's like in terms of luxury and availability of all kinds of goods and luxuries and vices. It's on par with London or whatever, or New York or San Francisco. But it's also, very, very distant from any sort of productive work. Unlike San Francisco, I think, or even unlike London. And then there is Siberia and the Ural Mountains and the Russian Far East, which was annexed from China in the mid-19th century. Basically, that's, Manchuria. And these are very, very, very different parts of the world, all sort of integrated by the Russian army and the hierarchy of power, and by the redistribution of this oil and gas profits. There's huge space, but all the revenue comes from one particular point somewhere in the middle of the space in West Siberia. So this is where the materiality of this wealth comes from, and then it would be sold in the West, say in Germany, etc., or in the East, in China and India. But the money doesn't go to West Siberia. Otherwise, West Siberia would be like Qatar, much richer than Qatar. But all the money goes to Moscow, and then Moscow redistributes this money, in all different corners and everywhere, according to its taste. And much of this money, of course, remains in Moscow, financing the elite, what is known as the corruption, all these villas and yachts that are now mostly sanctioned. I also spent several pages on these yachts, if you remember, and
Yeah, Putin's palace, which is all full of mold and really falling apart already.
Yeah, I mean, built by an Italian architect who was recently arrested actually by Italians for tax evasion in Italy. So the diversity of Russia, I think it's very, very promising because, with this suicidal war, and it's mostly suicidal for the Kremlin and for the current institutes of power, and also with the energy transition, which deprives this whole space of its source of existence. Energy transition in the world, so people would be buying less oil and gas, and therefore Moscow will have no power anymore, no financial power. And it's a process, it has not happened so far. It will not happen tomorrow, but it is happening. We see that happening. That's the source for optimism. And then all these different parts with their different traditions and ideas, and maybe even kind of endemic institutions that are probably mostly exterminated, but somehow alive. So all these different parts, they will have to find their own ways of life and also ways of governance. So some of these parts will develop democracy. Others will be whatever, theocratic or anarchic or just plainly barbaric. Or, of course, some of these parts will be taken by the neighbors.
What you're saying is that this war in Ukraine is going to be the cause of Putin's demise. It's going to end the Russian Federation, you're saying, that there are so many socioeconomic pressures that this has created that really Russia itself can't survive what it has done to itself.
I did say that about a year ago when I finished the text. And so far, the war is going on, and I wrote the book in the past tense in belief, as I write in the introduction, that when the reader will read it, it will be all over. The war will be over, and possibly the Russian Federation will be also done. So I wrote it all in the past tense. Unfortunately, you read it, it's still going on. But people, my utopian hope is that people will keep reading it, like maybe in 5 years from now.
So you still think it's inevitable that this is going to lead to the defederation of Russia? And you talk about the different constituent parts right now. You mentioned, it's such a massive country. I was on Google Earth the other day, kind of flying over Russia, just looking at it's mind-blowing, to see such a country like that. The United States is an amazing country as well. I've had the opportunity to do some traveling this year, and it's just a remarkable place. But Russia, it's like the United States on steroids when it comes to the geography and
regional inequality.
If this war in Ukraine is going to lead to the defederation of Russia, we also have the whole climate impacts of the war and where that's leading us. And we're going to have to deal with the idea that, the tundra is melting, the permafrost is melting. You say under very large cities, this is having a huge impact on society in Russia, and there has been, I'd like you to talk a little bit about the environmental impacts in Russia, because I don't know that people are that familiar with what's going on there, but it's quite disastrous, isn't it?
It is, absolutely. And the war consumes lots of fossil fuel and produces enormous amounts of emissions, just all these explosions and fires. And, I'm trying to monitor this, just do Ukrainians calculate these emissions, for instance, produced by the war? And there are some attempts and some different different think tanks actually doing interesting work on that. But it's like, so there are, less kind of obvious ways, because pollution of the soil by, these weapons, counter weapons made of heavy metals, mostly of lead, and lead is toxic. So mines will be, discharged, even though it will take, by the current tempo, it will take hundreds and hundreds of years to demine the land. But lead that remains there will be there, and it's toxic. It goes into the rivers, into the water, into the blood of animals. It's very, very long-term effect, and this massive scale is, just intolerable. And even World War II, the scale was, of course, much bigger, even bigger. but still there was no understanding of the kind of this limits of nature, of this unique moment that we call now Anthropocene. So having this barbaric war in the time of the Anthropocene is absolutely unimaginable. I could say kind of a horrible thing. It's really kind of cruel thing that, but in comparison to nature, even humans are renewable. More people born and dying, but nature, soil, water, whatever, atmosphere is not.
When I think about how much there's been a massive amount of forest fires in Russia. Was it in the millions of acres, huh?
Forest fires in Siberia, they are the biggest in the world, on par with some fires in Amazon, etc. But I don't know in Australia, but accounting for this forest in Siberia, is much, much worse than anywhere else. So we just don't know about these fires. Forest fires, flaring of gas. So that gas, so oil could be preserved in whatever cisterns or in reservoirs. Gas cannot be, preserved most of that. And so if Russia cannot sell it gas, it flares it, just burns into it. And there are massive flaring. It's absolutely tragic what's going on. Most of this oil, it went through pipelines. Now it goes by tankers. They crosses the Baltic and basically then goes around the world to the Indian and Chinese ports. So far, there were no major leaks, but there are dozens of tankers on the way every day, and most of them are whatever, they are old and they are out of standards. We could get another Chernobyl-scale disaster in the Baltic Sea any single day.
Yeah, I've been following the coral reefs around the world that are bleaching now, down in Australia, off the Florida coast. Right, this is a very significant problem for the world to confront as our oceans are warming. I was just on the East Coast visiting my family on Cape Cod, where I've gone for many years now to visit with them. And I walked out to the Cape Cod Bay and I put my foot into it, and it was like a hot tub. I was shocked. And the sea turtles there are, dying because of the temperature of the water. It's the fastest warming, one of the fastest warming bodies of water on the planet.
Yeah, heat waves, climate has been changing, and scientists know it. The first prediction of climate change and in connection to coal-based emissions was done in 1912. And then, of course, the Club of Rome in 1968 produced, very, very comprehensive study. The scientists know it all along, through decades, but people do not, because, there are whatever fires in Australia, or permafrost is melting in Siberia, but, where people live, whatever it is in New York or Shanghai, they didn't see it. But heat waves is the best argument for the actual danger, actual threat, intensity of climate change. Now, from this year, from probably it started like several years ago, every summer, people everywhere, in Paris and in Chinese and Indian cities, they are dying of heat. And now people really see it happening. That's actually a very powerful argument for democratic governance of climate action. Previously, it was all up to the experts, and people had no trust to experts, and you could call it whatever, populism, but people had their reasons to distrust the experts. But now people see it, people feel it on their skin.
Yeah, like what just happened in Lahaina, people running into the ocean to escape what was happening. I mean, it's absolutely frightening for people who are going through these things.
Yeah, but also, as experts say, and no single human could sort of check it, of course, but experts say that climate change in the north or in the Arctic areas, also in the south, occurs 3 times faster than in the in the whatever moderate climate, 3 times faster. So some way it is better for whatever, for local agriculture or navigation. But permafrost is, the smelting of permafrost is a major, a continental catastrophe.
Putin was saying how the climate change would be good for Russia, that we'd be more agricultural land would be available, for example. But he's completely ignoring or discounting the effects of methane. It's completely irrational.
Yeah, but there will be, epidemics and all kinds of, but also just also methane emissions coming from these frozen marshes, they would melt. But yeah, Putin said, yes, it will be good. So our agriculture is thriving, and it will be thriving even more because of climate change. And we will open navigation across the Arctic Ocean.
What do you make of all of this? I mean, will Russia ever become a democratic country? Or as you say, I guess you feel like Russia will defederate and the constituent parts will just go their own way and figure out what they need to do. So some of them will become more democratic. Some of them may become less democratic. Some of them may become anarchistic. So it's really something we don't know what will happen.
Well, if you ask me about my personal utopia, you could ask me, like, will my home city, St. Petersburg, I was born in St. Petersburg, will St. Petersburg will be ever democratic? And I think it will. I think that's my hope. St. Petersburg can do it. When it will do it, like in a year from now, or I don't know, in 25 years from now, I don't know that. But I hope that there is everything there in St. Petersburg, like well-educated populations, and reliance on labor of its citizens rather than, incoming resources, which, promises that it could be democratic. But of course, it needs, many things to happen. But the first thing to happen should be like its emancipation from Russia. What we have seen in the last decades was exactly the opposite. That Russia was somehow democratizing. It was making some kind of first steps towards elections and free information. But then, say, Chechnya wanted to claim independence. Whole system kind of crushed it, hit on this independent movement by horrible force, and also the whole system reversed or regressed to its sort of very kind of primary non-democratic condition in order to keep Chechnya. So what we have seen really was exactly the opposite, that the need to preserve the federation made any democratic development impossible, broke and hindered any kind of innovation, political innovation. So what we're talking about, say, St. Petersburg, will it be independent and democratic? Of course, would be great if it happens, but that needs a lot of change in the whole space of Russia. And this change is beginning, as President Xi said to Putin when he left Moscow. He said, things are happening that we haven't seen during the last 100 years. We don't know what he was smiling as he does, always.
A couple of very interesting things have happened recently, haven't they, in terms of, now in the United States, the Congress is having a discussion about these life forms from another dimension or another galaxy somewhere, and UFOs and reverse engineering machines that came from another galaxy. So, who knows, maybe Xi has something like this up his sleeve also. And Russia, too. It's not uncommon in Russia to have that conversation, too, I understand. So there's all kinds of things that could happen. For me, regardless of all those developments or probabilities, I keep thinking our political systems, democracy, and the better representation of the majority of people on the planet is really the most central, most urgent issue that we have. I think if we had better representation here in the United States, we would deal with climate change pretty directly. I think we would begin to change things quite quickly. I feel that way about China and Russia as well. Right now, we have 70% of the world living under some form of autocracy. Democracies are in decline. This is a very serious moment for humanity. We are in this race against climate now. The climate bomb is ticking, as Jim Hansen says. We have just a little bit of time now to get our act straightened out. I feel like the best way to do that is to foster more democratic institutions that represent human beings more equitably. Would you agree with that?
I agree that this is absolutely necessary. This constitutional change and radical nature, maybe revolutionary nature, but it's also, it's so different in different countries, even in the United States. How do you imagine it will happen? By a popular vote? How it's possible, really? Maybe a particular amendment, say a climate change amendment to the Constitution of the United States would be more realistic, would be actually very productive, even though we immediately understand how difficult it would be to overcome the resistance of whatever, of oligarchs really in the states, or people in petrochemistry such as the Koch brothers, and many others who just who are holding on to their source of power, which is oil. And oil really is the heart of darkness, really, because in oil these two issues, they connect and overlap. The hindrance to democracy in political science, it's usually called oil curse, what comes from petrostates or from oil connected people in democratic states. The Koch brothers is an example on the one hand, and climate change that comes with extraction of oil and burning oil on another hand. So these two issues like climate change and oil curse, they are connected in one particular point, which is oil.
Regarding political change, Peter was saying that we are in a period where we're going to shift into a new kind of civilization. He was contrasting the Age of Enlightenment to the 21st century. My thought was that during the Age of Enlightenment, this idea of democracy, that people would create their own form of government and govern themselves, was a new idea. The United States tried it out, only we weren't really that successful in terms of creating a government that really represented the majority of people. Other countries thought it was also a good idea, and over time, especially after World War II, a lot of countries began to create more democratic nations and governments. Now it's time for the United States to look at what we've done and determine whether or not we want to have a more democratic political system or not, and then use the same model that the framers had: a convention and a debate and a vote. I call those the three roots of a democratic society. Americans know about the three branches of government: the legislative branch, the executive, and the judicial branches, right? But the tree also has roots. I call them convention, debate, and a vote. It's not complicated. If societies could embrace those ideas and create a convention and have a debate and then have a vote, it would be relatively simple to transform political systems going into the future and to continually evolve them so that they are appropriate for the technology and the issues that those societies have. But for some reason, We're very reluctant to think it could be that simple. We shouldn't have a convention. We shouldn't organize to change the political system, even though I would say most people would recognize political system is failing us. Certainly it's failing Russians. But so, this idea that they would have a convention, a debate, and a vote, it seems like that would be intuitive for people by now. Create political institutions and political governance that is appropriate for the times we live in, for this Gaia modernity, right? It's going to require a new kind of political system that fully and faithfully and perpetually represents the will of the people. I think the people are probably the rightful rulers of the planet, that we, with nature, could do a really good job, but we have to get rid of this corruption. We have to get rid of this concentration of wealth, this inequality, if we're going to really successfully address this climate issue. Like you said, inequality and climate are two parts of the same coin, right? And so for me, it just seems like, why is that so complicated, Alexander? What are we missing here? Maybe I'm just naive, huh?
Maybe. Because there are very, very powerful people with their very, very vested interests to get their huge money, incredible money, from exactly the opposite to what you wish. You wish equality, they want inequality. They want to be on the top of the top. They want to be the cream of the cream. You wish climate action, meaning decarbonization, less emissions, more concern about nature. They wish more oil, more petrochemistry, more. And they are very skillful. You are also skillful in what you are doing. They are very skillful in what they are doing. And then now they have, this decades of experience, whether it is, Putin or people around him, whether it's the Koch brothers, people around them, they are, spending millions and billions of petrodollars for bribing people, for killing people, for doing good things at once, or at least one of those things. It's, to overcome this, you need to have more than they have. It's like at war. The offensive has to have like 3 times more people, whatever, and better weapons than the defense. And one could imagine it as as a fight between, say, the Soros funded think tanks and the Koch funded think tanks. But the proportion is not good for us. The proportion is opposite,
We can hope that people organize in St. Petersburg and create a more democratic society when this Russian Federation, if it does collapse.
This is what I hope for. But so my vision is similar to yours, but it's similar about the ends, but it's different about the means. So I see it coming from the opposite end, which is the climate change, these heat waves, other pandemics, deterioration of nature. So climate change would convince peoples of the world, that they need to modify their behavior, to burn less oil, to have different lives, maybe even to eat less meat, things like that. So climate change would force people to change very basic ideas and traditions and patterns of behavior. And it would also deprive the evil doers of their power.
Well, it makes it pretty complicated on everybody's part. I mean, if we could make those changes before the climate spun out of control completely, that would be a lot better. But, maybe you're right. Maybe nature's in charge in the end.
Nature will have its say.
Yeah, well, nature is screaming at us right now, so I hope everyone is listening. Alexander, have a great day, and thank you for coming on the Peaceful Political Revolution in America podcast. I hope we can do it again.
Absolutely.
This is going to be the end of Season 2 for me. I've got a lot of things on my plate right now. But I'll be back in January for Season 3, if at all possible. I hope you've enjoyed this series at least as much as I've enjoyed putting it together for you. It's been an amazing journey for me, and I hope you've learned a few things along the way. Thank you so much for your support and interest in this story. Not all political systems are the same. What seems to be universally true, however, is that all political systems eventually become outdated and corrupt. From time to time, and as inequality increases, those political systems need to be improved upon or even replaced. All technologies change, even political ones. The question going forward is whether or not Americans will finally create a full and effective democracy. Will we continue to depend on our 18th century, largely undemocratic, some argue corrupt political system throughout the 21st century? Or will we organize peacefully to improve this dysfunctional political system and, as Alexander Etkind proposes, move into a new and fully democratic Gaia modernity? Until then, stay safe out there.